Everyone, welcome to our Jewish Women's Archive post-quarantine book talk. We'll wait just a minute as people come in from the waiting room. And I know we'll have people from all over. And hopefully many of you are having better weather than we are here on the East Coast, where thankfully our guests for today, they had a tornado warning, but thankfully they did not get either a tornado or lose power. Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to the Jewish Women's Archives post-quarantine book talks. I'm Jenny Sartori, the editor of JWA's Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women. And I'm so happy to be with you tonight for the third in our summer series. If you're new to JWA and to what began as the quarantine book talks and has become and hopefully will remain the post-quarantine book talks, thank you for joining us. And if you've been with us for months, welcome back. Please introduce yourself in the chat box. Make sure to chat to panelists and attendees, and also add your questions to our conversation in the chat. We're delighted to be able to continue offering this program and to grow the JWA community. Before I introduce our featured author and our special guest for this evening, and before we begin our conversation, I want to say just a few words about JWA for those who may not know the fullness of our work. We're a digital archive that expands the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We take an intersectional approach to Jewish history and culture because we believe that uncovering the diversity of our stories helps us understand the world we live in and create a stronger, more just future. The post-quarantine book talks are one aspect of JWA's work, and I hope you'll check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer, including the new edition of the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women, which we launched just last month. Now, in addition to my role at JWA, I'm also the co-founder and co-director of the Adoption and Jewish Identity Project, which supports Jewish adoptees and their families in creating healthy personal, family, and communal identities, and advocates for an inclusive Jewish community that is fully welcoming to adoptees. As such, today's program is particularly important to me. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome today's guests. Gabrielle Glaser is a journalist and author who challenges the conventional wisdom on subjects that broadly touch people's lives. She has bachelor's and master's degrees from Stanford and has published widely on mental health, medicine, and culture. Her work has appeared in, among other publications, the New York Times Magazine, the Daily Beast, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Atlantic, and she has appeared on many national radio and television programs. She has published books on interfaith marriage, The Nose, subtitled A Profile of Sex, Beauty, and Survival, and Female Drinking. Her latest book, American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption, will be the subject of our conversation tonight. So welcome, Gabrielle. And we are very delighted to have with us today also Margaret Earl Katz. Margaret was born in 1944 to German Jewish immigrants to the US. In 1961, at the age of 16, she became pregnant and she was coerced into relinquishing her son for adoption. She and the baby's father, George, went on to marry and have 3 more children. Today, she is an advocate and spokesperson for adoption rights, and her story forms the core of Gabrielle's book. So welcome, Gabrielle and Margaret. So I would like to just ask Gabrielle to start us off by giving us a very brief overview of the story of Margaret and her son, who was born Stephen Earle and who became David Rosenberg. And it's the story that, again, forms the core of her book. So Gabrielle, could you just give us sort of the elevator version of the story, just so that people can help us situate the rest of our conversation for our audience today?
So in the book, I tell the story of David Rosenberg, who was born Stephen Earle in 1961 in Manhattan, to Margaret Earle and Stephen's birth father, George Katz. And they were separated by a culture of secret adoptions that flourished in this country predominantly in the years after World War II and up through Roe v. Wade. And when David, and we'll get to this later, David ultimately he was raised by and adopted by people who loved him very, very much, and was ultimately reunited with Margaret after 52 years of separation. And when I learned about this story, I wanted to be able to tell not only the narrative of David and Margaret, but also that of roughly 4 million other women who were forced by a coercive adoption industry, to surrender their sons and daughters. And so that's the story I tell.
Great, thank you. So I know we'll hear a lot more of the details of both the personal story of Margaret and George and Stephen, David, and also about the broader context. But I know you've selected a short passage to read from the book about a particularly painful and powerful part of this story. So why don't you share that with us now?
Okay, thank you. So here's just an introduction to it. In the months since the book came out, I've heard from countless adoptees who had always believed that they had been surrendered sort of blithely by their birth mothers. And my research showed that that was almost never the case in the post-war years. And it most certainly wasn't with Margaret. So I just wanted to give some context to that. After repeated calls to a city office, a secretary finally granted a visiting slot in May 1962 after Margaret's first rootless Mother's Day. Weeks shy of her 18th birthday, she wore a new pinstripe suit she'd sewn herself. George, too, now 19, wore his suit. He carried a large bag filled with his Polaroid, the immaculate white sweater, hat, and booties Margaret had knitted, a stuffed dog rattle, and a teething ring. They also brought photos of their trousseau, such as it was. It was a humid day, and the couple spent more than an hour in an airless room as they waited to see their tiny son. He was in custody by that time in foster care. When Margaret heard his cries in the hallway, she jumped up to meet the woman who carried Stephen in a plastic seat. She rushed to him, and she and George cooed to their baby as he grinned and giggled. Margaret peppered the social worker with questions about Stephen's developmental highlights, what he was eating. It was impossible not to notice his resemblance to George. A moment later, another social worker briskly opened the door. "Come with me," she commanded. Margaret followed her into a separate room. The woman shut the door behind her and sat in a large wooden chair behind the desk. She motioned for Margaret to take the seat opposite. The woman withdrew a cigarette from a pack of Pall Malls and lit it with a brass lighter she kept in a drawer. She exhaled streams of smoke out her nostrils and surveyed Margaret as she squinted beneath bands of buzzing fluorescent lights. "A diplomat wants to adopt your son this week," the woman told her. For the umpteenth time, Margaret stammered that she and George were getting married, that they wanted to raise their son themselves. She felt perspiration gather on her upper lip and underneath the arms of her blue suit. The woman pushed the forms across the desk and looked at Margaret in the eye. "If you don't sign these right now, your child will stay in foster care for God knows how long." Margaret shook her head. "We've got nothing to offer him," the social worker said. "This nice Jewish family will give him a wonderful life with every comfort." Still, Margaret refused. "You're a minor," the woman said. "You've got nothing to offer him." The more Margaret resisted, the more dire the social worker's threats became. She sat what felt like for hours, but the clock behind her revealed that she'd only been in the office for 10 minutes. "I'm not signing anything," she said, crossing her arms in front of her chest. "I'm keeping my baby." The woman took a deep draw on her cigarette and blew smoke directly toward Margaret. She smiled a pursed-lipped smile. "Really? You go right ahead and refuse." She glanced down at Margaret's file, leaned across the desk, and changed tactics. "Would you like to know what can happen to you, Miss Earle? If you don't sign these papers, we'll make you a ward of the state and send you to juvenile hall. Think how that will look with your parents. First the pregnancy, you want to get locked up now too?" The threat wasn't idle. Under 19th century laws known as wayward minor codes, juveniles whose actions fell under the general rubric of deviant were often committed to reformatory institutions. The long list of vague offenses included deliberate disobedience to parents, associating with disorderly persons, and moral depravity, under which willful premarital intercourse most certainly fell. The social worker stared at Margaret as she pulled out another cigarette and flicked her lighter open again. She clicked open the top of a heavy ballpoint pen and inched the papers closer to Margaret. Margaret felt like she was going to be sick. It was bad enough to have shamed her family, herself, with the baby, but the threat of juvie, where the authorities sent serial shoplifters, young prostitutes, and kids in gangs, was too terrible to contemplate. After everything she'd been through, this one hit home. What good could she be to her son if she was locked up? The tears came, a year's worth of humiliation, guilt, and fear. She took the pen from the social worker and scrawled her signature. Margaret understood fundamentally that she was surrendering custody of her son, but she didn't imagine that with the stroke of her pen, she was irreversibly severing all legal claims as Stephen's mother. Still, she clung to the fantasy that the decision would be somehow changed. Stephen would spend a few months with the diplomat's family and then be returned to her and George once they were married. She didn't read the document carefully. Tears flooded so profusely she couldn't see the words, and no one, not the social worker, certainly not an attorney, ever explained that it was irrevocable. She wasn't even given a copy of what she had agreed to. Margaret had been led to believe that God would take care of her if she did the right thing. Until that moment, she believed this Jewish adoption agency, her own community, her own people, would help her and George raise their baby, a gift from God himself. But looking down at the desk, at the papers she signed, she felt the stubborn optimism to which she had clung, cratering beneath her. What if there's an emergency, she asked the woman. If there's anything medical, tell the agency and they'll call his parents. She snuffed out her cigarette. Then she stood up, opened the door, and waved her hand for Margaret to leave. Stephen had long since been delivered back to his foster mother, and George was waiting for Margaret in the hallway. As soon as she saw him, she buried her face in his broad chest, crying so hard that she got his shirt wet. What is it, Margaret? He asked. They made me sign the papers, she said. They told me if I didn't, they'd send me to juvie. George wrapped his arms around her. His own hand shaking, he withdrew a Polaroid he'd taken of Stephen while Margaret was signing away her parental rights. In it, the 5-month-old baby looks up at his father, grinning toothlessly as he grabs his feet. His black eyes dance, delighted. George stroked Margaret's hair and murmured that everything would be all right. How? She exclaimed. They're taking him.
Wow. Margaret, I hate to even ask this because I can see it on your face. And I know that you've read this book and you may have heard Gabrielle read this passage before. But I was wondering if you'd like to share anything about what it's like for you to hear Gabrielle read this passage and recount what you went through almost 60 years ago. And feel free to take a minute.
When this happened, not 6 years ago, right?
60.
Yes. I've read it, but it's hard because it brings everything back. And this was the second time George and I saw him, and we were so hopeful. And we saw him first in March, and we really thought, that we would get him back. I had no idea what I was signing. I did not know it would be permanent, and I didn't expect it. And, I guess I still had hope at that point. And, but it's so important that this comes out. That's one of the reasons why I agreed to the New York Times article and also to Gabrielle writing the book, because it's just so important. This happened to me, but it happened to so many other people. And it's also so important for adoptees to understand that their mothers, their parents, most likely really loved them and wanted them. And this was done to them. It wasn't something that they wanted and planned. I love Stephen from the minute, he was inside of me. And, thank God George was able to be with me at times, even though if he went to touch my stomach at Lakeview or something, the people right away got up and said something. But it's just, I had no idea that all this was going on. And it's something that had to come out, and it's very, very important. I don't know if I answered the question, or if you have something else you want to ask. I'm sorry.
I think that what you're getting at is there's so many things that were going on then. There was the secrecy, there was the coercion, there was the lack of sensitivity to the feelings of both the parents and the babies who would grow up to be adults looking for who they were. And I think also it's really important, you were saying, it was both you and George. I think often in discussions of adoption, the father, the birth father, kind of disappears often from these conversations, but the birth fathers are a factor too, and often very deeply hurt by this whole process. Gabrielle, let's go back to the very beginning of your work on this project. I know you say in the book, it started out as a local story in Oregon about a kidney transplant. David, Stephen, the baby Stephen, got the name David Rosenberg on adoption. So at this point was named David, was sick and needed a kidney transplant. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to this original story, and then how it transformed into something obviously very different from a story about a kidney transplant.
So I was a reporter in my home state of Oregon in the early 2000s, and I had been covering adoption and surrogacy and assisted reproductive technology as a beat. And one day, a business reporter forwarded an email about a local businessman and a cantor at a large Portland synagogue who was receiving an adopted man named David Rosenberg, who was getting a kidney donation from a friend. And they had, because this is a Jewish audience, I can sort of get into the weeds in this. And he is the friend who was a match in order to donate the kidney was a man named Marshall Spector. And it turned out that the two men had ties going back to the old country. A relative of Marshall's had been a student of David's adoptive family, or vice versa. David had been adopted by a cantor. Anyway, so I wrote a nice story about Tikkun Olam and this adopted man who was getting a kidney. But in the first interview that I ever had with David, he told me that he hoped that the story would go viral and that his birth mother would see it and recognize him as her son. He had had a wonderful life with his adoptive parents. He'd lived all over the world, but they had long since passed. And he was hoping that he might be able to get medical information, not only for himself, but for his 3 children. So the story went viral, and a lot of other people donated kidneys as a result, but Margaret never saw that story. In 2014, I had moved back east with my family. I was living in New Jersey. I got a phone call from David in May of 2014, and he had taken a DNA test. And he said, "Are you sitting down? It's David Rosenberg. We've become friends. It's David Rosenberg. I found my birth mother. She lives 45 minutes from you. She married my birth father. I have 3 full siblings." And this was the clincher. She never wanted to give me up. David had been led to believe his entire life that he'd been an inconvenience to his birth mother and that he'd been unwanted. And he was learning at the age of 52 that the exact opposite was true. Not only did he have 3 full siblings, here was a man who had developed a vocal career, which is that's like a needle in a haystack. He was a professional singer, and his baby sister was an opera singer in Berlin. All of this information came to him in the first phone call that he had with Margaret. And it reversed a very powerful narrative for him. And we talked about my pursuing the story as a story and examining the culture of secrecy that had led to 52 years of separation between a mother and her son. And I was very drawn to the story, to this powerful narrative. What I didn't know is that I would investigate an entire culture, an industry, not only of secrecy, but also of corruption, of fraud, of deceit. which pretty much characterizes the post-war adoption industry. So that's the genesis of the story. And as you said, I use both Margaret and David's story to tell as a narrative spine for what was happening from Washington state to Florida. This was a nationwide system. I happened to focus on a Jewish mother and her son, but it wasn't just their story. It was our story as a nation.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about the research process as the story expanded from a story about a kidney transplant to a story about, as you say, the shadow history of adoption?
I am an investigative journalist, and I almost became an historian. And so I knew that Margaret's narrative was going to be really powerful. We happened to live, as I just mentioned, 45 minutes away from each other. And so I started meeting her. I met her. I found Facebook groups of other birth mothers who had been at Louise Wise Services, which is the Manhattan adoption agency, the Jewish adoption agency that handled David's adoption. And my research sort of bubbled out from there. There were several books that had been written on birth mothers who'd been coerced. There was one, an oral history of about 100 birth mothers. I looked at that, but I also began digging into archives from Oregon State to Kansas City to Toronto, and most definitely I spent a lot of time in New York combing through the archives of the agency. And I actually made a trip also to Memphis, Tennessee. We can get to that later, but I dug into libraries. I interviewed more than 100 birth mothers, dozens and dozens of adoptees, but I also reconstructed as much as I could David's life. He happened to have passed 3 months after he and Margaret met in 2014. So, but he left a lot of letters, a lot of emails that his friends and siblings shared with me. And I reconstructed his life as much as I could in Toronto and Israel through the help of his very, very large and generous network of friends and cousins. And of course, his wife and kids, who were also incredibly generous. Can't hear you, Jenny.
Sorry, you would think after this many months of Zoom, I would know to unmute myself. Did you receive any pushback from any of the agencies that you were, whose histories you were trying to uncover?
The Louise Wise Agency went bankrupt in 2004. So luckily I didn't have to come up against that because it's shuttered. Many of the details that I came across, many of the people who I expose, and I know we'll get to this, we talked about it, the other day in that conversation, who were truly villains in New York City at the helm of this Jewish adoption agency, they also died many years ago. So no, I didn't come up against any refusals, really, with one exception. With one exception, and we'll get to that later when we talk about some of the experiments that I discovered.
Okay. Margaret, I was wondering if you could also tell us, so, Gabrielle's telling us about her research from her point of view. What was your own experience of Gabrielle's research and of sharing your story that, now I know obviously by the time you were talking to Gabrielle, a lot of this history of secrecy, you had shared your story already, you had met your son, but for so many decades, your story was so shrouded in secrecy. And what was it like now to tell your story so completely and openly and in a way that you knew was going to be then in front of such a wide audience?
Well, I was very blessed because I had like about 7 months almost where I spoke or text or Skype with David almost every day. And, that was wonderful. Whether I was here, when I was on a cruise once and stopped in Boston and with my cousin, and, I spoke to him from there. And it was just amazing. Also, all the information that Gabrielle shared with me. When I was with David, he shared the family pictures. He shared, what his life was. But Gabrielle was able to dig deeply. She has writings that he wrote, like before he went to Israel, I think when he was 18. And, she shared with me all the time what his friends, his, different relatives said. So it enabled me to be able to see what his life was through other people also, which was just wonderful. I mean, you never make up the missed years, but at least he passed knowing he was loved and, knowing he had a family, and Sherry and him were unbelievably close. In fact, I think that's how Gabrielle even got in touch with me that time. She, contacted Sherry. And it's a big loss, but I look at it that at least when he passed, he knew he was loved. And I'm also so grateful how wonderful his adoptive parents were to him. And, that we got to know each other and the families got to know each other. Unfortunately, the medical things, the agency didn't come forth with. And I had contact with the agency over the years where they basically, just wouldn't give me any information and lied to me. After he passed, I was in Berlin and I went to the Kabad there when I got the phone call to say Kaddish, and I basically sat shiver in Berlin because I couldn't get back. And the comfort of at least, having been with him, knowing him, was fantastic. It was just fantastic, and everything that I learned. But as far as the horrible stuff, I knew nothing about any of that until, Gabrielle was sharing her research. I'm sorry, I lost my thought. Even when I was in Berlin, that's what I was coming to. I called Spence Chapin because that's who had sent David the non-identifying information, which most of it was complete lies. And I called them and I said, I'd like my son's records now. He has passed. And they could care less. Their answer was go to court. I mean, it was one of the few times in my life, Sherry was sitting right next to me and I just lost it. I just totally lost it. Because I said, I don't have his birth certificate. I still don't. It's like he never, ever existed. Everything, he was born in Staten Island. It's on his birth certificate, like the Rosenbergs had him in Staten Island. And, I feel so grateful that the story is being told. So other people, will learn the truth and not feel shamed anymore and come out and say, this happened to me, or how can I help? Or, maybe I really was loved. My parents didn't just throw me away. That's why this is so important to me.
So it sounds like, even though I'm sure that there were times that sharing your story so intimately must have been very painful, but at the same time, Gabrielle's research was in a way a real gift to you. It gave you access to some information about David that you otherwise wouldn't have known,
Yes.
because she was able to talk to so many people from his past, as well as so much information about the context, letting you know that you were not the only one who was going through this. American Baby, this book, it's an illustration of something that really lies at the heart of the Jewish Women's Archive's work, which is the power of personal stories to help us understand history and to give us a more nuanced picture of the past. And Gabrielle, as you write in this book, modern adoption has often been portrayed as this kind of win-win situation for everyone who's involved. This kind of happy image of that there's a birth mother and her family as well, kind of solving a quote unquote problem of an unwanted pregnancy. You have a baby who ideally gets a loving home, and adoptive parents who get a child that they've very much desired. And at the same time, for much of the mid 20th century, you had these enormous efforts being made to match children with prospective adoptive parents so that they would be able to pass as kind of natural families, as if they were not adoptive families. And all parts of the adoption triad were then supposed to just go about their lives post-adoption as if nothing had ever happened. And Gabrielle, your research just sort of blows this whole happy image completely apart. So if you could talk a little bit about why you felt you needed, in order to do this book, to go all the way back to the emergence of modern adoption in the mid to late 19th century in order to tell Margaret and Stephen / David's mid to late 20th century story. I mean, that took a lot of research, a lot of time, a lot of effort. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how this broad sweep of history helped illuminate this personal story and vice versa.
Sure. Modern adoption in the United States really began in earnest in the early 20th century, particularly in crowded eastern cities. Let me just precede that for a moment. Well, no, in the mid 19th century, crowded tenements, factories were just absolutely rife with disease, and new immigrants to the Eastern Seaboard in particular were dying. The breadwinners, the fathers of the family, were dying from cholera or typhoid or dysentery, any of the illnesses that really plagued our nation until we were able to provide sanitation and proper medical care to treat different bacterial and viral illnesses. So what to do with children who'd been orphaned? Many of them were roaming the streets, and for the last 50 years of the 19th century, many of those children were shipped out west to Protestant farms where they worked as indentured servants. That was something called the orphan trains, which many of you may have become acquainted with through the work of Christina Baker Klein's book. And then in the early 20th century, women in New York City who were influenced by something called the politics of maternalism, which took the view that we need to take care of the children, mother and infant welfare, child welfare in our own locales. And one of these women was a woman named Louise Wise, who was the wife of Rabbi Stephen Wise, the famous Reform rabbi. And she developed a Jewish adoption agency. At that time, adoption in New York State was predicated by the religion of the child, or rather the birth mother. So a Jewish child, Jewish orphan, would be assigned a home or would be placed in a home in a Jewish home. Same with a Catholic child and a Protestant child, and so on. So originally, these adoption agencies, there were several in New York, Louise Wise Services, actually it was called the Free Synagogue Adoption Committee, Spence and Chapin and several others, really had at their heart the wish to place orphans in homes and not have them just roam the streets or live in orphanages. But the mandate of those adoption agencies shifted dramatically in the years after World War II. Suddenly, after decades of a very low birth rate in this country from the Depression and World War II, there was a huge push for Americans to have children. Obviously, we know that what that era was. It was the baby boom. And if you were precluded from conceiving, if you were infertile, the only way for you to start a family was to try to get a baby through an adoption agency. And suddenly they were flourishing, financially robust companies that operated on this premise. Behind the scenes of the baby boom that was being fueled by married American couples, it was also a very conservative social period in our history. There was no sex education. There was no birth control, even for married couples, until Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965. And abortion, of course, was illegal. At the same time, teenagers, young people had privacy in new suburban homes, in the backseat of family Buicks, in rec rooms, and the rate of unwed pregnancy skyrocketed. It more than tripled between 1944 and 1960. And those women, like Margaret, those some 4 million young women, most of them were sent away. The vast majority of them were sent away to secluded maternity homes where they were forced to live out their pregnancies in secret and shame. They delivered, and their children were placed with strangers. And due to secrecy laws that sealed off original birth certificates and then issued an amended, when an adoption was finalized, issued an amended birth certificate listing the adoptee's new name and his new parents as if they had been his original mother and father. I know that's a really big, long backdrop to the question you asked, and I'm getting to it. So that is set the stage for these adoption agencies to flourish. And they did, there were hundreds of them nationwide. At Louise Wise, where the demand for a Jewish baby in the years after the war was, I think in the late 1940s, there were 30 waiting couples for each available baby. And then by the time Stephen was born in 1961, that had shifted to a ratio of 10-1, but the demand was still extremely high. And then how did you assure the parents on the waiting list who were eager, really almost desperate to create a family? How did you ensure that the right baby went to the right family? Adoption was still very hush hush. People were secretive about it. They didn't necessarily want their adoptive parents didn't necessarily want their children to know that they had been adopted. There was a great deal of secrecy in this era. And Louise Wise marketed itself by the fact that it could produce blue ribbon babies for blue ribbon parents. And it had a series of matching techniques, which I guess we'll get into momentarily. But that's what they offered. They wanted doctors and lawyers and business people to get the smartest babies. And if you were a postal worker or a clerk, then you would get a baby who the agency deemed as less smart.
So I think that question about the lengths to which these quote unquote experts went to try to match children and adoptive parents is such a tremendously troubling part of this story. I don't think it probably doesn't surprise people that they were trying to match by appearance. So it was all within race. There was no transracial adoption in this period. And it was relatively easy probably for them to try to, they knew what the birth parents looked like, to match appearances. But it went so far beyond that. And like you say, these efforts to match by intelligence, well, how do you know what the intelligence is if you're trying to place a baby? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the lengths to which they went to try to measure that in these ways that to us today actually seem, I mean, I don't even think sadistic is too strong a word.
Barbaric, yeah. So the agency was really studied with luminaries in New York, in the New York medical and scientific community. They had a forensic anthropologist who helped try to determine babies' skin tone, future skin tone. by the name of Harry Shapiro. There was a consulting psychiatrist whose name was Viola Bernard. And most dastardly, there was a pediatrician by the name of Samuel Karelitz, who developed what he believed was the ultimate test of how to determine a baby's intelligence. How? He thought, Karelitz believed that the babies who cried the most were the most intelligent. And he developed a technique, not even a technique, it was a gun, a rubber band gun that shot, it was about this big, and it shot a thick rubber band like the kind you would have around a pile of mail. It shot the rubber band at a very high speed on a 10-minute-old infant's foot. And then Karelitz and his researchers would record the cries. This test went on for periodically, for at least 3 months. And Karelitz had this harebrained, sinister idea that the loudest wailers were the most intelligent. And it's bad enough to know that somebody even had this idea and carried it out. But what was most chilling to me, and I have the chills, I've been around this material for this particular aspect of the material for more than 3 years, and I'm still chilled to the bone. The United States government funded this research for more than 15 years. It was approved and published in peer-reviewed journals, from the Journal of Pediatrics to JAMA, and nobody blinked an eye.
Yeah, it is truly horrifying. And I know there was a question that went through in the chat about 3 Identical Strangers, and that comes out of that experience. That was a film that came out a few years ago about triplets who were placed for adoption and separated, and then the subject of a study as to sort of nature or nurture by studying twins and triplets who had been separated at birth. And you mentioned Viola Bernard's, and she was one of the leaders, or the force behind that story. I don't know if you want to say a couple of words about that story as well.
Yeah, sure. Bernard was a consulting psychiatrist. She was on the board of Louise Wise for decades and decades. She was a child psychiatrist, a German Jew, who was obsessed with the idea of the question of which mattered more, nature or nurture. And when these girls would come in pregnant with multiples, she was especially delighted, and this was in her archives at Columbia. She was especially delighted when they would be identical, twins or triplets. She considered this and put it in writing as a perfect natural laboratory to be able to settle once and for all which was a bigger force, nature or nurture. And so it was her idea, along with a guy named Peter Neubauer's, to separate these multiples, put them in different in homes of different socioeconomic backgrounds, and study them throughout their early childhood and adolescence. And this was all happening concurrently directly alongside the rubber band studies, which, by the way, lasted from 1957 until the early 1970s. So, yeah.
Appalling. It's truly appalling. Somebody mentioned in the chat, says very chilling, reminds me of Megala. So I think this is a good time to sort of transition into talking a little bit about this book and as a Jewish story. And maybe starting a little bit by thinking about how the Holocaust shaped many aspects of this story. This was happening in the immediate post-Holocaust period. And while there weren't the same kinds of informed consent rules and transparency rules that there are today, those kinds of ideas about medical ethics and ethics in experimentation were certainly emerging at the time. As you comment, many of the scientists doing this research were Jewish, and this was much of it was happening in association with Louise Wise adoption agency. Now, by no means only Jewish agencies. This was happening elsewhere as well. I want to make that clear. This is not. We don't want to give the impression that this sort of shadow period of adoption and all of this secrecy and all of these chilling things are exclusively Jewish. But the fact, in a way, that they were happening at all at a Jewish agency post-Holocaust. How do we make sense of that? I know you almost say in the book, they were Jews, shouldn't they have known better? So how do we, as a Jewish community, kind of make sense of the fact that they did not know better? They clearly did not know better.
That's a question I wish I had an answer to. And I have pondered that and ruminated on it and asked everybody from my own rabbi to rabbinical scholars to medical ethicists, bioethicists, and no one can say. We don't have their internal thoughts about how they justified these experiments to themselves. The only thing that, and it's really unsatisfying, you and I talked about this a little bit the other day. I went to the bioethicist Arthur Kaplan at NYU, and I came with the studies and I said, how do you make sense of this? What were they thinking? How could this have gone on? These were Jews doing this to Jewish babies in the shadow of the Holocaust with full knowledge, as what the viewer mentioned sounds very Mengele-like. And his thought was this, that because this was being funded by the United States government, and the triplets and twins study was being funded by the Jewish Board for Family Services and other, it wasn't funded by the US government, but it was funded by prominent Jewish agencies, because it got this sort of funding, because they were conducting these experiments in a hospital and not a concentration camp, maybe they could somehow make sense of it to themselves. And in the wake of the annihilation of European Jewry, did they somehow convince themselves that, well, we have to put the Jewish family back together and we need to make it we can make it better than nature could itself? I don't know. I wish I had the answer to that. And you mentioned this, you were talking about informed consent. In 1947, the United States signed the Nuremberg Codes, which established the need for informed consent. 1947, the first rubber band study appeared, the funding appeared in 1950. The first study, actually published study, appeared in 1957. And the separation of the twins and triplets began in the early 1960s. They knew what was going on. The UN was right down the street. So,
but it's interesting. I think those informed consent laws were in place, but as you comment in the book, in a way, that was part of what pushed these experiments to kids in foster care in the adoption system, because clearly, if you need informed consent, no new mother is going to give permission for somebody to shoot rubber bands at her baby's feet. So the only way they could do these studies was to do them on kids who had been relinquished, often under coercion, for adoption, and then the adoption agencies or could give that permission.
Exactly, and that's what happened. That's what happened. And I just want to make a point. The rubber band studies were happening to babies who'd been surrendered all throughout New York, Catholic Charities, New York Foundling Hospital. This was happening citywide. So it wasn't just Jewish babies, but even any baby, it doesn't matter. You wouldn't do that to a dog.
Right. So, I mean, this is a story that is both universal. It is not just a Jewish story, but it also is a Jewish story very much. And you make it a point from the very beginning, from the first page of the book, to sort of emphasize that this is a Jewish story. You talk about David describing himself when you ask him, how am I supposed to recognize you when I come to see you in the dialysis center? And he describes himself as the olive-skinned, bald Jewish guy with glasses. And you talk about playing Jewish geography with him that first time. What is particularly Jewish about this story? Are there things that you think would have been particularly different if you had been talking about, Catholic Charities versus, as opposed to Louise Wise, or the Florence Crittenden home versus Lakeview, where Margaret was sent during her pregnancy? Or even if you'd had a Jewish birth family and the child had been adopted by a non-Jewish adopted family? That's a big question. So,
I have a lot of thoughts about that. I knew David.
In about 3 minutes.
Okay, I knew David. I'm a Jewish person. The story was it was so compelling to me that it took place, number one, in the shadow of the Holocaust. Margaret and George. Margaret was the daughter of two Jewish refugees. George was the son of Viennese Holocaust survivors, and the people who adopted David were Holocaust survivors themselves. There was this veil of loss that was somehow, maybe there was to create a new family in the shadow of all of this loss for the Rosenbergs was the greatest thing that they could ever have imagined. And young people like George and Margaret were simply told, you can have children of your own one day. And is there something particularly Jewish about that? Not necessarily. That's why I interviewed more than 100 birth mothers. But this story at its heart drew me, I think, in part because of its Jewishness.
So in our last couple of minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about how some things have changed since this shadow period in the mid 20th century. Margaret, I know when you were, I think, in your 30s, you had your first encounters with what became known as the adoption rights movement. Can you tell us a little bit about that encounter when you went to that meeting of ALMA, the Adoptees Liberation Movement Association, and how that encounter spurred you to try to search, ultimately unsuccessfully, for your son?
I saw an ad for it in one of the papers, and I had to come up with stories of why I wasn't going to be home or leaving. And I was terrified that somebody would see me or find out, because everything was so secretive. And when I got there, I just felt sort of like, wow, there's other people like me. And I also got the information of how to start searching, where they told me to go to the public library on 42nd Street and to go through all the, there were huge books to try to find the number of David's birth certificate. It was originally, I was looking for Stephen, and I found that number, and they said, you're not going to be able to have anything with you. You can't write it down. Remember the last four numbers, and then you'll be able to match it up. Because they took everything from us. We couldn't have our license, anything. It was like we were criminals, and they looked at us like that when we were going through the birth records. And I was never able to find his, but the day that he called me and he said, are you sitting down? I think you're my birth mother. And I blurred out the four numbers. And, so at least he knew that, I had looked for him. because it was just like knocking myself against the wall with everything. But going to the meeting, even though I didn't go to many of them, was also great because it was, even though I sort of physically didn't constantly have an ally, I knew there were other people out there that were going through the same thing I did. And living in a tiny town where you have to go pick up your mail, and in those days, most of the postal people were your neighbors. I couldn't even have anything sent from Alma to me. It was basically sent to the woman, Pam, who ran Alma, and then she would get it to me. And I had even found something as I was cleaning out in the garage that was sent that way, which I shared with Gabrielle. I mean, it was a different time and a different world. You know, I also don't think, you know, my parents or George's parents or, you know, parents of other people who were sent away really wanted to any which way hurt us. They thought they were doing the right thing, that, you know, they were saving us from shame, because in those days, this was like the most shameful thing that could happen to anybody, no matter what religion you were. You know, and this was not a Jewish group, Alma, it was everybody. And I got to meet people to say, hey, this happened to them. You know, like Gabrielle said, Catholic charities, you know, all the different places.
I think that's very one of the big things that movement brought was a sense of community.
Yes.
That you're not the only one, and that was true for both birth parents who were looking for children, as well as adoptees who were looking for birth parents, and working collectively to try to change this culture of secrecy and shame. And I think that also, you know, really speaks to how intense the secrecy was. You kept the secret, you and your husband, George, kept the secret from your subsequent children until David contacted you. And then you were able to reunite as a whole family. Unfortunately, minus George, who had already passed away, which must have been particularly poignant for you, knowing that David didn't get to meet his birth father.
Well, the horrible thing was I didn't know what to do after George passed in 2000. And my neighbor suggested I go to her. I don't remember if he was a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And he was the first person I spoke to about this. And I said, my husband passed. He had always said that there was no point in telling the children because there's nothing they could do about it. And we didn't even know if David was dead or alive. And in 2000, there was no, you know, DNA or anything. I had no idea. And he turned to me and I got the same words from him that I got from Louise Wise and others. You need to forget this ever happened. This never happened. And I walked out of there and I never went back.
It's shocking that was still happening in 2000. Yeah. I would like to believe that in the last 20 years, we've come some distance from that in terms of a recognition of the power of openness, the power of open communication, the danger of secrecy, and how secrecy is just, it's not a foundation for a family. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Are there any last thoughts, Gabrielle or Margaret, that you'd like to share with the group?
I do, very quickly. I'm so sorry that I can't get to everybody's questions. Please feel free to reach out to me, but it's really important. One of the reasons that we wanted to expose this story is that in only 10 states have lawmakers opened up original birth certificates to adoptees to allow them access to their own original identities. New York, recently Connecticut, Oregon, Alabama, just 10 states in this country allow adoptees the right to their own original birth certificate. And we are hoping that this book draws attention to the fact that that needs to change in all of the other 40. And it's slow going, and it's hard to believe that anybody is even still caring. People should not be secrets.
Margaret, would you like to share any last words?
No, I feel the same way. You know, that was the reason that I first did the New York Times article with Gabrielle and that I agreed to do the book. I really feel the records should be open everywhere. It's everyone's right, not just to know what their medical backgrounds are and if it can help them and for their families, but also where they came from and who they really are. I mean, they are children of their adoptive parents, and the adoptive parents, you know, I'm sure love them to death and are thrilled to have them. And that's one family. But there's also a missing link that if they want to find out, they should be able to. It's not right that the government, you know, keeps that from them. And also for birth parents, I really thought I would, you know, die like George did, not knowing what happened to my son. At least, you know, thank God the nightmares have stopped. And millions of people are going through this. And it's just not right. This is
Right, I think,
2021.
right. And it's really important now, I think, for people to recognize that, as you say, in most cases, the adoptive parents, they're good parents. They love their children very much. But it's still important to recognize that at the heart of adoption inherently is loss. Even if it's loss that might in some cases be necessary, but it's still loss that everybody needs to deal with. So I would invite everyone, if you haven't already, to read the book. And if you have questions that we were not able to get to in this short hour, I know Gabrielle put her email address in the chat and her website. I would also encourage you to reach out to her or to me. I'm also happy to answer questions, jsartori@jwa.org. So I want to thank you so much, Margaret, for sharing your story with Gabrielle and with us. And to thank you, Gabrielle, for all your hard work in uncovering this just heart-wrenching period in both Jewish and adoption history. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us this evening. And I hope you'll check out jwa.org. We have so much more material to discover and to help you gain insight about the diversity of the Jewish story. And please join us next week, same time, same place, for a conversation with Rachel Beanland, author of Florence Adler Swims Forever, a summer story of 3 generations grappling with a shocking tragedy, heartbreak, romance, and the weight of family secrets. So that will be a very different story, although perhaps joined with a theme of family secrets. Until next time, be well and good night.